You have a big homework here. You have 10 minutes.
All right, let me, I won't be able to, thank you. I won't be able to address all the issues, but let me just sort of start, in the issue that in the order they were asked. I mean, I do think like two of the examples, didn't take very long. The Green Revolution technology was spreading in the second half of the 1960s. The Congress Party lost an election in 1977. It didn't take much longer than 10 years, and cotton, the mechanization of cotton picking went from 0 to 100% in 15 years, So I think those are actually, I picked those examples deliberately because they're pretty rapid, it seems to me. It's not like Gordon Brown, with his, in establishing the rule of law, the first 500 years is the hardest, I don't think, that was one thing Gordon Brown said, but so I thought they were quite rapid, So of course, other examples may, the other examples you can think of take longer. And so that's my kind of first response to that. And of course, the world is always different and technology is radically changing. And, I think it's easy to imagine much more rapidly, I mean, one of the things, I don't work on this so much, but one thing Professor Acemoglu is working on a lot is like robots, what's the consequences of the robots? Think about self-driving cars. The biggest male employment in the United States is truck driving. There won't be any truck drivers in 10 years. So that's massive. Now, I'm sure you can think of all sorts of terrible scenarios associated with that, but I'm just saying that's happening fast and it's going to be massive. So I do think, and your point, I guess, is technology is changing a lot, and then, things are happening at different speeds. And let me also say one thing, which has come up quite a lot here, in terms of the Muslim Brotherhood or whatever, you said, are people ready for democracy? So here's the way I think about it. And, this is going to sound a bit crazy when I start talking, but you'll get the idea after a bit. So Professor Acemoglu and I, we sort of thought a lot about this, actually. And the way I think about it is, human beings are we're primates. The most closely related primates to humans are, chimpanzees. Chimpanzee society is extremely hierarchical. Gorilla society is extremely hierarchical. The emergence, everything we know historically about the sort of transition, to Homo sapiens is that Homo sapiens were like radically egalitarian compared to primates. This is like one of the biggest sort of mysteries, in evolutionary biology. Like, why are humans so, why are we so different from societies with these alpha males and silverbacks and things like that? And so the explanation that evolutionary biologists have is that, basically that's a power equilibrium, like the alpha male, if you ever seen gorillas, like the alpha male is like the big, thing. And what did being an alpha male get you? You got to dominate females. You got to have more sex, more children, very Darwinian. Okay. So, and the other alpha males didn't like it, but they were stuck. That was the equilibrium. Okay. So what creates this transition to human society is development of technology, is development of language. Language helps you coordinate. Okay. So Darwin actually proposed what he called the execution hypothesis, which is that the transition from primate society to Homo sapiens, the big change is the emergence of language, which allows you to coordinate, to bring the silverback, to bring the alpha male down. Okay, it's a leveling device. Think of Greek mythology. Think about Zeus and Hades and Poseidon. What do? They bring Kronos down. So that's a perfect metaphor. So like for me, there's something fundamentally egalitarian about the deep kind of evolutionary roots of human society. And I must say, everywhere I've worked in the world, I've always thought like humans are, there's something fundamentally democratic about human society. So when you say of course, hierarchies can emerge and hierarchies can be justified. And, you know, the Bolsheviks, you know, contested an election and they soon got rid of that, you know, and the Muslim Brotherhood have this anti-democratic ideology. And, you know, the Taliban, I've been reading about the political system of the Taliban recently, you know, so of course there's anti-democratic ideologies. But like for me, even in China, you know, where there hasn't been democratic institutions for about 2,500 years, since before the first kind of dynasty, there's still something about humans. It's part, for me, it's like deep in our evolutionary history, you know, after all, there was hundreds of thousands of years, you know, after the alpha males got brought down, you know, before the Neolithic revolution or modern society emerged. So that's kind of my view. So you may disagree with that, but my sense is that even though there's anti-democratic ideologies, it's like there were many in history, and justifications for having a non-democratic society, you know, alpha males, you know, didn't have time to construct an elaborate ideological justification, you know, for why, you know, why they were on top and you weren't. You know, they were better. They went to Harvard. You know, they did better in their test scores, and you know, so I just, that's my kind of. That perspective sort of influences the way I think about lots of things, you know, and I guess in most places I've worked, I've always found people intensely, you know, democratic, you know, and many small scale societies, local societies are very, very, I don't know much about Egypt, so I apologize, but I think that's my answer to many things. Like, yeah, are people ready for democracy? I don't know, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood maybe have an anti-democratic, you know, the Taliban, they don't believe in democracy, you know, they have a completely different idea about, you know, how legitimate political authority is exercised. But my feeling is that I bet if you went to like local, you know, Pashtun society, it's kind of pretty male dominated, but actually you'd find it to be terrifically participatory. You know, if you read ethnographies of like how decisions get made in Pashtun society, it's extremely participatory, you know, adult males. Okay, but you know, there's a big element of participation and democracy. So that's my kind of perspective. Now, of course, you know, that you were saying that, oh, great, you know, we get stuck with the Muslim Brotherhood for 30 years before, you know. No, I understand. I think, you know, if you look at human history, you'll see that there's many anti-ideological, you know, but what's, you know, like, so maybe it's just the lesser of evils, you know, like Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst political system except for all the others, you know, it's the lesser of evils, you know, so, and, you know, maybe, so that's kind of my perspectives. And I guess that's my answer, you know, that's my answer, you know, to all of, you know, to many of these things that came up. I think, you know, in Dr. Mustafa, that, you know, yeah, I think, you know, informal institutions are important. You know, one of the things that, you know, female labor force participation did was it eroded all sorts of informal institutions and kind of made men rethink many norms, social norms and practices. So I think that's important. You know, I think, you know, you made this very Hobbesian point also about people want order. You know, I think that's a very deep insight into kind of modern society, that security, order, you know, this sort of Hobbesian demand for the state, demand for authority. And I, you know, so, you know, I think that's right. And, you know, and actually talking to people here the last week, it's kind of really remarkable the way people talk about this chaos in the post-Arab Spring period has sort of created this demand for authority, which has kind of led in some sense to a sort of legitimation of the current government in a way that might not otherwise have happened. And I think you see that a lot in human history. So I think that mechanism is important, you know, but and I think also, you know, I tried to answer your other question about, you know, this to people, you know, there are all these anti-democratic ideologies, you know, why don't I put weight on that? Well, I think I sort of explained that, you know, because I have this fundamental view, you know, about human society, you know, and it's kind of, you know, the emergence of Homo sapiens out of related primates, but you were complaining about this being long term, you know. Sorry, that's just how I am. Sorry. I mean, China, you know, so I mean, I think that, you know, so we discuss this a lot in Why Nations Fail. So my view of China is, you know, economic growth in China clearly took off in the 1970s when they started dismantling socialism. You know, they moved to a market economy. You know, they deregulate, you know, the first wave of growth is demolishing, you know, collectivization in agriculture, introducing incentives, allowing people to make their own decisions, kind of deregulating prices. You know, you got exactly what a textbook economics presentation would suggest. You know, that moved into industry, et cetera, et cetera. But the Chinese have an advantage over many places. You know, they have strong centralized state authority. But my view, you know, and the view, we talk about this a lot in Why Nations Fail, is that they do not have the political institutions necessary to create a really prosperous society. There's many examples in world history of these transitory experiences of economic growth. Think of the Soviet Union. You know, you know, some of you may be old enough, you know, to remember, but when I was an undergraduate at the London School of Economics in 1982, we were taught that if you wanted to have rapid economic growth, you had to have Soviet-style central planning. You say that to young people nowadays, they laugh at you. You know, they just think like, what was he drinking? You know, whatever. You know, that's not what they say in the United States. But what was he smoking? They say in the United States. But you know, people laugh at you now. But some of you remember that. You know, and indeed, the Soviet Union did grow rapidly for 50 years. You know, it fooled Paul Samuelson, it fooled the CIA, it fooled their own leaders. You know, Khrushchev said, "We will bury you." You know, and there's many other examples of that. Argentina in the 50 years, you know, up before the 19. Argentina was one of the 10 richest countries of the world in 1920. Okay, it rode this boom. China's been riding a boom too. Look. Jack Ma mildly criticizes the regulatory authority, he disappears for months. You can't have a successful, innovative economy organized like that. I'm sorry, totalitarianism, there's no experience of doing it. And I don't care, you know, face recognition software, AI, blah, blah. The Soviets were very good at military technology and a few things, you know, rockets and tanks. And you know, they were good at a few things, but they couldn't do anything else. So I don't think China has the political institutions necessary to be a successful country. You know, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. That's what you see. President Xi is turning things into a personality cult. Look at Chinese history. Look at what happens. You know, so that's my view about that. There's no model of China. You know, there's no Chinese model, you know. And I don't think there's a model of benevolent dictatorship. You know, the other thing that every dictator loves to tell you about, you know, I've met many dictators. Every dictator loves to tell, we're just like Lee Kuan Yew. You know, in Gabon, they say, we're just like Singapore. In Kazakhstan, they say, we're just like Singapore in Kazakhstan. You know, I mean, in Congo, they, you know, come on, seriously? I mean, so yes, Singapore was very successful. It had an extraordinary man running the country. It was a little city. You know, it was a developed country in 1960. It had ports, it had banks, it had education, it had university, it had all sorts of stuff. Okay. So, and it had someone who wanted to develop his country, you know, and that's good. But how many instances in world history, and what's your mechanism for getting somebody like that? I think what we know is that democracy, and it's messy. You know, you gave examples, you know, of people give examples of democracy is messy. Look, I'm English. I think Brexit was a complete disaster, but democracies make mistakes too. You know, you just have to put up with it. So nothing is perfect, you know, but I think what we know is that on average, democracies do better, you know, so just in terms of these questions about causality, I've done a lot of research on this, a lot of research on it. And I can tell you that the data is very clear that economic growth does not cause democratization, but democracy does cause economic growth. It leads to higher public good provision. It leads to better economic growth. The example I always like, which I think is good on democracy, when the First World War started, you know, the German democracy collapsed and the army took over. Ludendorff and Hindenburg ran everything, okay? And it looked, to start with, they were going to be very successful. The British, everything was a mess. The trade unions were on strike. They wanted higher wages. They thought, great, we can get all these concessions off the government. You know, it was chaos. You know, the Labour Party was like blocking whatever, you know, and people started saying, you know, look at the Germans, the military in charge, you know, we just need to move to that model, okay? Turned out to be a disaster. The military had their plan, the Schlieffen Plan. It worked great in 1870. The world had changed. Weapons had changed. Didn't work. They kept on trying it. It didn't work. They tried again. It didn't work. They tried again. The British, to start with, it was all a fiasco. Okay, that was a fiasco. Now what do? People had different opinions. They had different ideas. No, they came with different examples. They debated. It was messy. It took time. The trade unions were on strike again. You know, they had to close the pubs to stop people getting drunk. You know, it was only Tony Blair got rid of those regulations. But guess what? That turned out to be 4 messy years later, the model that actually won the war. So I think that is a very interesting example of democracy is messy, but people get their opinion. You learn. There's other information people can test. They disagree. They say, no, it didn't work. Let's do this. No, you can't do that in a command and control system. You have a bit of a command and control system here, don't you? So I'm told. Okay. So that, there's too many things to talk about. I think, women. Yes. Women, yeah, I think, youth and women, that's like the thing that really hits you in the face in Khartoum, actually, like these resistance committees, young men, young women, if Sudan manages to create a consolidated democracy, it'll be young men and women who did it because they didn't give up when the military mounted a coup 13 months ago and everyone gave up and said, and the diaspora went back to the United States and said, that's it, They understood, democratization is not an event, it's a process. It takes time and struggle, and it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back and 1 step back and 2 steps forward. And they forced the military, to get back to the negotiating table. Yes. I think that's a great example. I could give you lots of other ones. The last few years I've been doing all this work in Eastern Nigeria, which is absolutely fascinating because, women are so empowered politically. So all over Eastern Nigeria, the traditional political institutions are what the anthropologists call dual sex political systems. So there's a parallel political system, one for men and one for women. There's like a chief, there's like a king or a queen. The queen is completely unrelated to the king and chosen separately by the women. It's absolutely fascinating. And the most powerful organization in a village in Eastern Nigeria is something called the Umuada, which is the association of daughters. So when a man dies, the daughters of the village have to assemble to bury the man. And then they sort out stuff. They sort out disputes. They go after abusive men. It's amazing. It's amazing. So I think, we could talk about that. That's one thing I've actually been trying to understand. Kind of, it's absolutely fascinating. Okay, so unintended consequences may be fast. What about international institutions? Here's the way I think about that. I was talking about the US South, like I talked about mechanization of cotton picking, but the US South could never have happened, possibly, but outsiders played a huge role. Outsiders came, they helped organize voting, they helped the civil rights movement. They came, every summer, Gavin Wright, actually, the economic historian whose data I showed, when he was an undergraduate at Yale, he'd go down every summer to the South to help organize people. So I think everybody needs help. I need help. Everyone needs help, and many of these equilibrium, I think outsiders can play an important role, but you have to think about it the right way. If you don't think about it the right way, you're not going to have an impact. So in that example, I could give many other examples where outsiders played an important role. One of my friends is a trade union activist in the United States, and he always says, a company or a plant never spontaneously unionizes. Okay, people never get together and form a union. Outsiders have to come and kind of break the equilibrium, and that's when unions form. So I think outsiders can play a very constructive role. I don't know that that's the role that the IMF and the World Bank play, because they don't think about it the right way. But I think they can play a constructive role. I think the Gulf. The Gulf is very interesting also, like to me, these Gulf states are, they're like, I always like, what Sheikh Maktoum said though. Sheikh Maktoum in Dubai said, my grandfather rode a camel. My father drove a Land Rover. I drive a Mercedes. My son drives a Mercedes. His son will drive a Land Rover and his grandson will ride a camel. So there's this, even they recognize, the elites recognize this sort of potentially temporary nature of the thing. I do think it's sort of remarkable what's happened in the Gulf, but I would say, the reason it works is that they're able to sort of leverage this traditional social and political system. You know, there's an amazing book by this historian Christopher Davidson about the construction of Abu Dhabi, that when the modern state, you know, in 1965, the Sheikh didn't have electricity, you know, in his palace, you know, so they didn't have a modern state. So when they create this modern state, they have these things called ministries and ministers and people like that. What the heck do you do with that? You know, well, you give one to each of these families, you know, so he goes through these ministries and shows how, you know, it maps onto this sort of tribal structure. You know, that was a very powerful social system of kind of legitimacy and these, you know, and it gets reconstructed within the modern state. And actually, I think many success stories like in Botswana, in sub-Saharan Africa, that, you know, the success of Botswana is it was able to adapt this traditional political system to modern liberal democratic political institutions that made it very legitimate and very stable. In some sense, that's what, you know, that's what Paul Kagame, it's much more conflictual in Rwanda. But if you look at how things work in Rwanda, it's exactly because President Kagame is able to take traditional institutions and kind of recreate them within a state and use them to implement policy. You know, if you look at his Twitter, which is very interesting, you see he's always giving cows out and stuff like that. You know, he uses all these traditional mechanisms of patron-client and authority and respect, and so that, you know, the guy is a genius. You know, but and I think that's like Sheikh Maktoum. It's a bit like that. You know, they're able to, but this is a much more complicated country. You know, you can't do that in Sudan. You know, you can't. You know, because you can't do it in Nigeria, because in Nigeria you have 200 traditional systems. You don't have one. They only have one in Abu Dhabi, you know, and one in Rwanda. You have two. What do you do when you have 200? You know, this is the plight of most post-colonial society. I mean, I think that's, you know, what's something I've learned, you know, which is interesting about Egypt is like I keep asking people, like, what's the non-Cairo view? You know, like I work a lot in Colombia and South America. If you just went to Bogota, and you'd never understand what goes on in Colombia. You know, you have to go to the provinces, you have to go to the Caribbean coast, you have to go to the south. Everyone has a different perspective, but everyone says no, that's not true in Egypt. You know, in Egypt there's a sort of, that's interesting. You know, I find that interesting. Of course, there's lots of problems in Upper Egypt. You know, but yeah. So the Gulf, again, you know, I think human society is very creative. You know, humans have created many different types of institutions and ideologies and ideas. And, you know, some people are in a situation where they can use that to achieve something which other people can't. And that's good. But like, what's the model? You know, like always people ask me, you know, what's the Chinese model? You know, or what's the Dubai model? I don't think there is a Dubai model because, you know, the Egyptian society is so different, or Sudanese society is so different. I mean, the Magna Carta, yes, okay. You know, I was talking about the Magna Carta yesterday, actually. You know, that's a big discussion. You know, I think that in our book, The Narrow Corridor, if you give me your address, I can send you a copy. You know, we trace the history of the emergence of, you know, of democratic, prosperous, you know, England. And I think that's, as you're saying, sir, that's a very deeply seated historical, I think it goes back before the Magna Carta, actually, but it's a very historical, that is an important moment where, you know, important principles get established, but it's coming in the context of history before that. Let me say something about, I said about what causes what, but let me say something about South Korea. You know, I think the way we talk about South Korea, you know, is sort of similar, to go back to this discussion of China, is that like, you know, like China after 1970, like 78, you know, like many other examples, you can have growth under autocratic regimes, you know, in some circumstances where you have what we call state capacity, you know. So when President Park, you know, decided he was going to push exports, he was going to push economic growth, you know, he had the kind of bureaucratic capacity to get the state to do it. You know, he nationalized the banks. And he said to these people, you know, like Samsung, Hyundai, all these business people, like, okay, if you export, you get subsidized credit. If you don't hit the target, I'm going to take it away. You know, he used to meet every month, you know, so I always think it's very interesting. Every month he chaired on Fridays, the export promotion committee. And he dragged the CEOs of all these businesses into the room and wanted to hear, what are you doing? Are you doing anything? Like, what are you doing? Are you hitting the target? Like, what did you export this month? Like, you know, he was on those people's cases from 1963 until he was assassinated in 1979. He had prizes and awards. He created all this status around exporting. If you go to it, if you're ever in Seoul, go to his, there's a museum, there's a President Park museum. It's really amazing. Half of it is about exporting. The guy was nuts. You know, he was obsessed with exporting, you know. So it was so here's my take on that. That would never have been sustained without this transition to more democratic political institutions. You can be lucky. You can get a Lee Kuan Yew. You can get a Park Chung-hee. And they can do amazing things, you know, and that's great. You know, they can do it fast. You know, they can do it in 10 years or 15 years. But how do you sustain that? How does that accumulate? You know, how does that took a political transition. So the perspective we take in Why Nations Fail is that that's the example of what we call extractive growth, you know. That could happen in China. I think that's very unlikely because in China, there's such an ideology opposed to it. South Korea, the military never had a philosophy of rule. The South Korean military never thought we're the legitimate rulers of this country. In fact, after President Park was assassinated, they tried to extract themselves pretty fast. So I think that for me is very important about the continuation of that Korean economic miracle. Yeah, but what I'm telling you is this. So on average, what you see is democracy comes before increased public good provision and before economic growth. There are some examples, not many actually. Everyone uses the same examples, but for every example like that, I can quote 20 that failed, you know, like the Philippines, for example, you know, many other examples completely failed. So what the data says is that on average, you know, democracy precedes increases in public good provision and economic growth. And there's many examples of that. Botswana, Mauritius, you know, look at Kenya, you know, look at Kenya. You look at Kenya under the one-party state, you know, Kenya has boomed, you know, since the transition to democracy. There's a lot of evidence on the impact of democracy on public good provision in Kenya, the emergence of economic dynamism in the flower industry, and expansion of coffee, for example, which was massively taxed during the one-party state, taxed almost to oblivion all over Africa. The coffee economy flourished. Ghana, same thing. You know, transition to democracy has led to economic takeoff. Of course, there's lots of problems, you know, in these countries, you know, and yeah, there's examples like in South Korea or, you know, or Singapore where somehow, for some reason, you get a benevolent ruler. But my question is always the same. How do you find that person? Maybe you have that person in Egypt. I don't know enough about Egypt to know, you know, but most places I go, you don't find benevolent rulers, you know, and I just ask, what's your mechanism for finding it? How do you find a benevolent ruler? What do? You know, like the Dalai Lama, you look for the next Dalai Lama, you look for a child with the right, I don't know, like no one has a plan for how to find a benevolent ruler. You know, I've never heard a good plan for how to find a benevolent ruler. And I think what we know is for all the mess of democracy and whatever, that's your best bet for actually getting policy, you know, which is in the interest or the collective interest of society. I feel I'm running out of steam here. Oh, climate change. Yes. Yeah. I'm not, you know, I'm way out of my comfort zone. I've never done research on climate change. And I think, you know, I would say the academic economics profession it's astonishing how little research is being done on climate change in economics. It's still not a fashionable topic in economics, despite how incredibly consequential it is for society and things like that. So I guess, you know, if you pushed me to say something, I'd say it seems much more likely to me that, of course, it's difficult to make agreements, it's difficult to make collective agreements, but, you know, who was it who created the European Union, who managed to create, you know, the United Nations or sustain many of these this is a collective problem. We have to work on this together. We have to agree together. We have to counteract it collectively. You know, who is likely to be able to do that? You know, Russia, President Putin. I mean, you know, like for me, yeah, well, yeah, but then you need voice, you need participation, you need, I mean, to me, it's democratic societies are much more likely to be able to act in the interest, you know, the collective interest to do something about that, but I don't underestimate how complicated that is. You know, so far there's just woeful inaction relative to what should be happening. I have a very good friend who's a climate scientist at Columbia University, and so I know something about this. And you know, but if you're pessimistic now, you talk to him. No, he's not a climate scientist. He's not a climate scientist. He's a bad economist. So he's a bad economist. His work is terrible. You take his empirical papers and try to reproduce them. They're all phony. I'm serious. They're completely phony. Bruce Kane is called. He's a climate scientist. So, you know, like his point is that what we know about the climate is it's a highly non-linear system. It's highly non-linear. So that means you can have catastrophic changes for small, you know, it's not linear. It's not like we heat, you know, people think this is all linear. You know, the world heats up a bit and like some worse stuff happens. No. The world could heat up a bit and things could get much, much worse dramatically. That's what's really scary. Yes, there's much more, it's much more scary than this sort of, people show these graphs, oh, the world is like 1 degree. And you think 1 degree, like what's the big deal with 1 degree? You know, I just take my sweater off or something. No, that's not the problem. That's not the problem. So, okay, but I you know, that I don't have anything good to say about that.
Thank you. Can I, two very quick points about the climate, given that Egypt had COP27 here and all. I think the climate problem is the one that's going to force for global democracy in the entire world, and the change in Bretton Woods agreements and a change in the way the world is operating, because the northern countries, the North is actually benefiting from the situation at the expense of the entire global South. And so I think this would bring about, this is the unintended change that you are talking about in a real sense for the entire world. One last word also about the Gulf, something very relevant to the Gulf that we're not talking about, but it makes all the difference. The actual Gulfans, the actual people from the Gulf are very few. In Kuwait, 30% of the population is from Kuwait, in Emirates, in Dubai, and all of them. So very few people are from the country. The others are just working there. So basically, when they divide the ministries among them, the economy is for them, plus few others who are all managers. No one is less than a manager ever in the Gulf. So this is different from the other countries. Yeah. One last thing that you have to tell your wife, because it's very, very important, about women in Egypt. Women in Egypt work inside and outside, and this is what makes it very powerful. She said, "No, what's the difference? You're working outside instead of inside?" Now we do both. Okay, and we're really stuck. And any female in the room would tell you this 100%. I don't know how to thank you. This was extremely impressive and very, very nice. We took a lot more time than what was originally planned and what's allowed by your schedule, but it's worth every second, and everyone is very happy. I want to thank very much Dr. Ahmed Galal. For those who don't know, although I know that all of you know, Dr. Ahmed Galal was in charge of this center for 10 years. He's the one that actually built it. And the idea of the Distinguished Lecture Series is his initiative, along with so many others. So we are capitalizing on all his good ideas and all the technical infrastructure that he provided for this center. I'm very lucky to learn from him and to have him. Thank you so much. This was extremely nice, and I thank you all. And until next time, we're going to do a lot of meetings, and we're going to cancel the hybrid option, because people have this terrible intention of staying in their pajamas at home and enjoy the lecture, which you are not going to allow. So there will be no hybrid. You have to come physically. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you.